Well, I think the first thing I would highlight is the demand for educational psychologists. I guess that many trainees today would be astonished to hear that when I finished my training in 1981, I was the only one of the 7 trainees at UCL that had a permanent job. One of my colleagues had a temporary job, and of the other 5, 2 went back into teaching and never worked as educational psychologists. Whereas over the last 30 years, there has been pretty well full employment, and indeed at present, an acute shortage of educational psychologists. What happened to change that? Well, in 1981, an Education Act was passed, implemented in 1983, that really put on a legal basis the involvement of educational psychologists in the formal assessment process for children with special educational needs for the first time. And although some members of the profession have said that that was a really bad move and it tied educational psychologists to an assessment role, actually, I think that much of the demand within local authorities, certainly initially over the last 30 years, has been attributable to that, and certainly the funding, more importantly, from the government of educational psychology training can be traced to that statutory requirement. It has given us the opportunity to do all sorts of other things, and I think that linked to the demand, there was also then an increased focus on working with and through adults. And I would highlight that as probably the second, big change that happened, partly because of the demand issue, but partly also a growing appreciation of the importance of prevention and early intervention. Both of those drove approaches such as consultation and training. Surprisingly, that up until the mid-80s, educational psychologists were comparatively little involved in training teachers and others, and that changed quite radically. I suppose the other change that I would highlight links to the increased focus on litigation. We had the Education Act, indeed a succession of Education Acts, the Code of Practice, which was first rolled out in '94, but subsequently, of course, updated. And all of those aspects increased, obviously, special needs tribunals, but also other legal challenges to local authorities, and in some cases to educational psychologists themselves. And I think that led to a sense that the profession needed to have profession-wide defensible definitions of their work in various areas of practice. And the British Psychological Society, the professional body, of course, was very heavily involved in developing those. A very recent example is the Delivering Psychological Therapies report, which of course Sandra Dunsmore, the current director of the programme here, was heavily involved in producing. And that really set out the parameters within which these interventions, which again, as the focus on mental health, as well as special educational needs, became part of the educational psychologist's remit, assumed greater importance over time. One of the first of those reports by the British Psychological Society was one that I was involved with, and it related to dyslexia. It was really focused at that point. It rose directly from litigation, which involved an educational psychologist, and at that time, dyslexia was essentially defined and assessed by looking at discrepancies between a child's IQ, cognitive functioning, assessed by an intelligence test, and their reading capacity. Unfortunately, there was no evidential base for that. It was an administrative convenience to do this, and it also had the very serious side effect of preferentially discriminating against children who had English as an additional language, whose cognitive academic functioning, as assessed by such intelligence tests often took much longer to develop once they'd started learning English. Indeed, many educational psychologists were so opposed to the use of this admittedly completely flawed procedure that they refused to have anything to do with the term dyslexia even. And there was this wide-held public perception that educational psychologists didn't believe in dyslexia. And the report, which was led by Ray Raisin from Manchester University and which involved 5 of us in developing an overview really and a set of guidelines for professional practice at that time, drew on the current research that had been developed by Professor Uta Frith at UCL amongst others in recognising dyslexia as a neurologically based difficulty with processing phonology, and recognised also that this acceptance of a biological base wasn't condemning a child to a lifetime of difficulty, but rather was something that could be intervened effectively with, in much the same way that those of us who have a biologically based visual problem can, with the use of glasses and a nice environmental intervention, overcome that. And it led to the development of many intensive evidence-based reading interventions, which in recent years, with the advances of neuroscience, have been shown also to modify the neurological functioning in the brain. Well, we are talking about quite a long period here. Although I was programme director from 1994 through to 2015, which I think is the longest duration of a programme director to date, I was an academic and professional tutor for the previous 8 years when Tony Klein was the programme director. So we're talking about a 30-year time span here. And I suppose the most obvious structural change over that period was the change from a master's, 1-year master's programme, to a 3-year doctoral programme, which was implemented in 2006. But in actual fact, the British Psychological Society had decreed in 1997 that the change should occur such that master's programmes would be no longer accredited after 2001. Clearly it took another 5 years to actually get to that position, but it probably is why it feels to me as though the change from master's to doctoral training wasn't just a pinpoint in the mid noughties, as I think they're referred to, but rather quite a prolonged slog through various government departments, reports, professional discussions and other debates over pretty well a 10-year period. In the article on the website, I think you've got, I track the history of developments in professional training really since about 1969 and look at the forces that were both impelling us towards longer training and restraining us from taking that much needed step. But so I think anyone that's interested in that will be able to get all the gory details from that article. If I move on then to talk about changes in content of training rather than the structure, I think the changes in content closely reflected changes in professional practice over that period, and they were paralleled by the continuing professional development programmes for experienced educational psychologists that we ran at the same time. So as professional practice changed, our programme content changed to equip trainees to be able to carry out the new range of tasks and deal with the challenges they were facing. And Likewise, then, having developed training materials for that purpose, we would then modify them and offer existing practitioners parallel programs. So, for example, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the increased working with adults was reflected in courses on effective in-service training, which was a new endeavour to quite a few educational psychologists, and systems work in schools, which again was quite a recent departure. And I guess that over the last 10 years, there's been a greater focus on training on direct intervention with children, which again parallels the earlier trend that I was identifying for psychologists to be increasingly involved in working with young people vulnerable to mental health issues, as well as those with special educational needs. So, for example, training in cognitive behavioural therapy skills, mindfulness, video interactive guidance, all of those sorts of aspects have seen a marked development and a production of quite a structured and rigorous set of processes offered both to trainees and to experienced practitioners. Obviously, in the case of CBT, there's the UCL master's programme that Sandra Dunsmuir was very heavily involved in developing, and is still flourishing and thriving to this day. I would say that training at UCL is characterised by a commitment to evidence-informed and research-based practice at every level. So, if I can give you just a few examples, our trainees learn to conduct their casework using a problem analysis framework that involves hypothesis testing, critical appraisal of both information and evidence, case formulation, and intervention planning that is grounded in available psychological research and synthesised using what we call the interactive factors framework. This is a framework that was developed from the causal modelling approach developed by Professors Uta Frith and John Morton here at UCL, and it enables the trainees to model the hypothesised links between the issues being experienced by the child and young person and the likely effects of the interventions that they are consulting on and discussing with their teachers and parents. And that provides a very solid and defensible base for practice, which can draw on psychological theory and research in any area, depending on the issues being presented by the child and young person, but which allows a clear evidence trail that others can look at, debate and challenge. So really it is an important tool for the development of defensible practice. Our tutors also draw on the psychology of adult learning in constructing their teaching sessions. So that again is research-based practice, but from the tutor team, as opposed to simply encouraging the trainees. We like to practice what we preach, I guess. And indeed, we draw on the psychology of adult learning also in developing the curriculum as a whole. So, for example, the use of problem-based learning, which we introduced with the Doctorate in 2006, was seen as extremely important in developing skills of self-directed learning, problem-solving and group working, as well as acquiring knowledge and understanding, and recognising that trainees and indeed the educational psychologists of the future won't just need today's knowledge, they will need to be able to continuously update their knowledge and understanding throughout their professional career with those skills of self-directed learning, be able to apply critical thinking in problem solving across a wide range of areas, many of which we probably even haven't thought of yet, and also the group working, where the individual practitioner has given way very much to the team around the child approach, needing to work with and through others, a theme from that I was talking about being introduced in the 80s, but now working also with other mental health professionals and professionals in children's services teams. So I think that that's been an important aspect, and indeed I would say that this commitment to evidence-formed and research-based practice ensures that we keep at the forefront and are always pushing the boundaries. As a consequence, we in turn have published articles about our work, so about the problem analysis approach, about problem-based learning, and of course Tony Klein and I published, we're now in our third edition of the textbook Special Educational Needs, Inclusion and Diversity, where we tried to bring together some of the psychological research most relevant to understanding the range of special educational needs so that it was readily accessible to trainee educational psychologists and to professional practitioners more generally. And indeed, I think that our focus on producing resources to support research-based practice, not only of our trainees, but of the profession more generally and other professionals working with children and young people, has been evidenced in the production of the Effective in-Service Training Resource Pack, for example, which we produced back in 1990. And more recently, we have focused particularly on the area of assessment, an area that has been a long-standing issue with educational psychologists, but where we have needed to hand over some of those skills to teachers and others working with children. So in the area of assessment resources, for example, Tony Klein and I produced an approach to curriculum-related assessment with bilingual children, drawing on a working group of practicing educational psychologists. That was published in the mid-1990s. Sean Cameron and I produced the Psychology in Education portfolio, which enabled the testing of a whole range of hypotheses about aspects of social and emotional development, as well as cognitive development and learning skills. That was in 1999. And more recently, again reflecting the broadening practice of educational psychologists, Sandra Dunsmore and I in 2009 produced the Measures of Children's Mental Health and Psychological Wellbeing, which looks at a whole range of areas for promoting well-being and preventing psychological distress that has proved to be very valuable to practitioners in schools as well as to educational psychology services. Of course, the first of those resources that we produced, I think, at UCL, focusing specifically on assessment, was back in 1997 when we produced the FAB, the Phonological Assessment Battery. That was, again, the result of a working group of practitioners and academics, notably led by Professor Uta Frith and Uta Ray-Raisin from Manchester, who, if you remember, was responsible for coordinating the Dyslexia Working Party for the British Psychological Society, and I produced the Phonological Assessment Battery, which provided educational psychologists and teachers with the ability to look at children's phonological skills and to implement an identification process to dyslexia, which was culturally much fairer than the previous discredited approach, and which enabled for children with multilingual backgrounds to be able to have access to the interventions that had been previously restricted to those formally assessed as having dyslexia. In fact, the Phonological Assessment Battery took off to such an extent that it's featured on the UCL website under Impact Case Studies, where it was a case study was developed for the 2014 Research Excellence Framework, and in that it talks about the development of the battery, what it's achieved, and provides some fairly staggering statistics, such that it has been used with something like 38,000 children in 34 different countries. So I think that what characterises training at UCL is that we have this commitment to evidence-informed and research-based practice, and we follow it through pretty rigorously and seek to make available the research base that we've discovered, not only to our trainees and our professional colleagues, but much more widely for the benefit of children and young people.